Hello, colleagues and esteemed guests. I am Dr. Angel Daniels, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Kenya Beard. Dr. Beard is the Associate Provost for Social Mission and Academic Excellence at Chamberlain University, the largest nursing school in the United States. As a 2012 Macy Faculty Scholar, she focused on increasing workforce diversity and strengthening educational equity. In her former role as Senior Fellow at the Center for Health Policy and Media Engagement at George Washington University School of Nursing, she wrote blogs and co-produced healthcare disparities segments for Health Cetera on WBAI-FM for an audience of over 400,000 diverse listeners. Dr. Beard has consulted with numerous schools across the country on ways to strengthen diversity. She led the New York State Action Coalition in constructing the state's 2014 Workforce Diversity Toolkit and contributed to the National League for Nursing's 2016 Diversity Vision Statement. She co-created the Josiah Macy Foundation's 2018 groundbreaking document, Improving the Environment for Learning in the Health Profession, and more recently co-authored the publication, Racism and the Diversity Policy Paradox, Implications for Nurse Leaders to Help Combat Racism in Higher Education. Many of her publications amplify the importance of graduating a diverse workforce that is prepared to improve healthcare access and quality. Her workshop, Leading in a Race-Conscious Society, is supported by the Harvard Macy Institute's Program for Educators in the Health Profession. She was honored to serve as a reviewer for the National Academy of Medicine's Future of Nursing 2020-2030 report and recently joined the National League for Nursing's Taking Aim initiative to raise awareness of societal inequities affecting healthcare outcomes. She provided the NLN's inaugural webinar, Leading Conversations That Center on Racism. Dr. Beard is a fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine, American Academy of Nursing, and the Academy of Nursing Education. She serves as an advisor for the New York Academy of Medicine's National Health Equity Scholars Network, and it was recently appointed to the American Nurses Association's National Commission to address racism in nursing. She is the chair of the American Academy of Nursing's Diversity and Inclusivity Committee and serves as the board member at large for the New York State Board of Nursing. She also serves as the editorial board member for the American Journal of Nursing. So without further ado, I introduce to you Dr. Kenya Beard.
Hello, docs, also known as DNPs of color. Thank you for this invitation to keynote your inaugural conference. I am so happy to be here to talk about leading in a race-conscious society and improving healthcare outcomes from the classroom to the clinical arena. Your voice and presence are needed in healthcare. Why is that? Back in 2003, the Sullivan's Commission report asserted that racial and ethnic diversity is key to improving healthcare outcomes. This statement was in response to the 2003 IOM document, Unequal Treatment, which stated that the quality of healthcare for minorities and individuals who live in poverty is not always optimal. Why is that? Why is it that race, ethnicity, and income continue to be significant predictors of the quality of healthcare that's received? You might have heard that social determinants of health drive patient outcomes. Social determinants of health considers where one lives, works, prays, and plays, but how does that contribute to healthcare disparities? So I think about a story of this girl, a little girl, 6 years old, named Lisa, who had asthma. Lisa recently moves to an area in the city, and 4 times within 1 month, she ends up in the emergency room with an asthmatic attack. On the 5th trip to the emergency room, Lisa had such a prolonged period of anoxia that it left her brain dead. What happened? How did that happen? Some thought it's the mother. The mother should be brought up on charges. Child Protective Services should be called in. There was no neglect. Jack Geiger, one of the pioneers of community health centers, stated way back in the 60s that to treat symptoms and then to send patients back unchanged in knowledge, attitude, or behavior to the same physical and social environment, also unchanged, that overwhelmingly help produce their illness and will do so again, is similar to providing antibiotics for food poisoning and then sending the patient back home to eat the same food that caused the illness. And that's exactly what happened to Lisa Gomez. Lisa was sent back to the very conditions that contributed to her demise. Lisa lived in an area of the Bronx called Asthma Alley. And the air quality in this part of New York, where Lisa lived, is the worst for the entire state. So what happened every time Lisa went outside to go to school? What happened when she went to play outside? The social determinants of health is where she lived, where she worked, where she played and went to school. So did Lisa have a chance to achieve her highest level of health? Absolutely not. So what would you have done? How would you have flexed your diversity muscle to make a difference? Because going back to the Sullivan Commission report, it said if we could just diversify the workforce, we could help begin to eliminate healthcare disparities. But the social determinants of health, they are not the only factors that undermine healthcare outcomes. What's the second reason? Provider bias. Provider bias is another factor that contributes to poor health outcomes. But what is bias? And what does provider bias look like? Well, we know that provider bias means that we have beliefs, thoughts, and attitudes that could be conscious or unconscious, but they are going to drive our actions. When we think about the VA study that said, when they looked at white male veterans and Black male veterans, and they said, wait a second, we don't know why this is happening, but the Black male veterans, when they had osteoarthritis, they weren't given pain medication to the same extent that the white male veterans were given pain medications. What was that all about? And then they said the information. We didn't always give the Black male veterans the same information that was given to the white male veterans about their condition. Why is that? So in a classroom setting, I usually share with my students a story about Miss Smith. Miss Smith is an African-American female who presents to her primary care provider for a follow-up visit. And her provider is concerned. This is her 3rd or 4th visit to him. And her blood pressure and her A1C is not to goal. What are your thoughts on that? You have a provider who has a patient. Patient's not to goal. Blood pressure is still through the roof. Blood sugar, not the A1C is not to 7. And you have 10 minutes with this person. So what are the reasons why Ms. Smith is not at goal? You have her on metformin to control her blood sugar. You have her on a beta blocker or a calcium channel blocker to control her blood pressure. Her BMI, 28. But her provider, because he feels like he doesn't have a lot of time, just increases her medicine. Is that going to solve the problem? Do you know how many people are walking around with uncontrolled hypertension. And not just with uncontrolled hypertension, but who have had uncontrolled hypertension and now had a stroke, and they look like us. Why is that? We think medication is a panacea, that it's going to correct all the ills of society. And it doesn't. Because we know that racism can contribute to this inability to get people to goal. We have to think beyond the social determinants of health, behind unconscious bias, because when we think about Miss Smith, we have to understand Miss Smith, yes, she's an African-American female in her 50s, but she has a son. And her son just started college. And he commutes, so she bought him a nice car, but they live in an area where, because he has a nice car, Miss Smith is really afraid that the police are going to target her son. And you see the climate that we're in and what happens sometimes when a Black male is stopped. And the assumptions that are made if he has a nice car. So she's afraid. She's afraid that the police are going to pull him over and that he's going to get scared and maybe throw up his hands and say, I didn't do anything. But they're going to interpret him throwing up his hands or panicking as a sign of guilt, that maybe he has a gun in his car and it's going to trip their amygdala. They're going to get scared and they're going to shoot her son. We've seen this play out. So we can't pretend like Miss Smith is irrational. So what do we do with that? Because we know if Miss Smith is thinking every day that her son leaves the house, that something horrible could happen to him, your cortisol levels go up, your aldosterone levels go up. That's going to make your blood pressure and your blood sugar go up. So again, what are we doing about this? Miss Smith is one of the thousands of minority patients with uncontrolled hypertension, race-related. So hearing her story, what would you do differently? How would you flex your diversity muscle to make a difference? So we see the social determinants of health. We see how they operate. We see what happened to Lisa and how she died. We see how unconscious bias. We've seen the studies. There was a study at Stanford. They looked at NICU units, babies, newborn babies in a neonatal intensive care unit, and how their outcomes were different based on provider bias. So yes, we have standards of care, but does that mean the standards of care are always being followed? And when they're not, and we see these disparate outcomes based on race and based on providers not following the standard of care, what does that mean? So let me ask the question again. What would you have done differently? How would you have flexed your diversity muscle? Because we understand that the social determinants of health, what happened to Lisa, is not limited to social factors. When we think about Miss Smith, yes, Miss Smith is living her lived reality where she is so afraid for her son that is driving her cortisol and aldosterone levels, and it's impacting her ability to get to goal. So when she comes back to see the provider, it's not likely that increase in her blood pressure medication is going to give us the results that we're looking for. Miss Smith is in a situation where, unless we talk about the root cause of her uncontrolled hypertension, unless we talk about that, we're just chasing a ghost, because the medication is not going to do what it's supposed to do. And we're surprised by the thousands of people who have uncontrolled hypertension in this country. And then we look at all of the research that says, here's why. If we don't address the setting, the situation, she's at risk for a stroke. So what would you do differently? And how would you flex your diversity muscle? So yes, we talked about social determinants of health. Yes, we talked about provider bias, but they are not the only factors driving poor outcomes. We said there's racism as well. So we have to think about structural racism, the fact that it has been indicted as a key factor for healthcare disparities. And while our country, even our health professions, has been slow to call this out, the CDC just this year recently declared racism a public health threat. And since Breonna Taylor, since Mr. George Floyd's death, numerous organizations have now denounced structural racism and vowed to address the metastatic nature of racism. But we're saying that it's wrong. But what are we doing about the policies, the practices, how we teach students, how we provide care? Where do you begin when it appears that racism is all around you? I remember during my son's, I think it was his sophomore year, he came home from school and he said, "Mom, I didn't know being an African American was a risk factor for having a low IQ." And I said, "Excuse me, what did you say?" He said, "Yeah, my teacher said being Black was a risk factor for having a low IQ." So I'm livid, right? This is my son. If any of you out there are mothers and you have a son, especially if it's an only son, you're like, who would dare say something to my son? And you just don't do that. I don't care what race you are. This feeling transcends all races. You don't talk about a mother's son. So I'm like, oh, he's so impressionable. He's only 19. Who in the world would say to my baby that he has a risk factor because of the color of his skin? He's at risk for having a low IQ. Give me your teacher's number. He knew I was upset. I said, give me her email because I need to email her, right? I'm from the generation, when you get upset, you want to know who the president is because you're writing a letter and you're expecting answers. So I was really upset. And for some reason, I was like, forget the email. Because he said, no, Mom, don't email her. It's not her fault. So he's sticking up for the teacher. And I'm like, what do you mean it's not her fault? She's the one who said it, right? He said, yes, but she was only repeating what was in the textbook. What? So I said, bring me your textbook. So I'm thinking the textbook is old, it's outdated. He got the wrong edition. It was a 2019 edition. What? How could your psychology book say that being Black was a risk factor for low IQ? I don't believe this. Show it to me. Opens up to the page. Number 5 or number 4 in the box on the page. Risk factors for low IQ. Number 4, African American family. Wow. I cannot explain to you the flood of emotions. No wonder, I get it. Do you know how many studies I've read where physicians, nurses failed to do something because they said, well, I figured they wouldn't understand, or I figured they didn't know any better. We have students today that if you ask in a classroom, tell me why Miss Smith's blood pressure is still high. Top 3 answers on the board. Why is her blood pressure high? Do you know the response you would get? She's not taking her medication. She doesn't understand the medication. She doesn't have access to the medication. It's always the patient. And then some of us will say, well, wait a second. It's not always a patient. Maybe it's external factors. But when I saw in my son's textbook, in this intro to psychology textbook, that the reason for low IQ, the risk factor for low IQ was the African-American family, I said, no wonder why we have providers, because everyone in the healthcare disciplines, nurses, physicians, PT, probably OT, ST, I don't know, social work, all of us healthcare providers, most of our curriculum requires that we take these gen eds or an intro to psych course. And if we're reading this book and it is creating the lens through which we see our patients who are African American, this is problematic, because now it creates this bias, this belief that even if it's implicit or explicit, the belief is there that your patients, because of the color of their skin, the amount of melanin in their skin, is going to somehow prevent them from understanding something, so don't even bother explaining it. Patients die because of bias. Medical errors are the third leading cause of death. When you disaggregate that based on race, what does the literature show you? Who's more likely to die from medical errors, from bias? This can't be. So I'm livid. I'm reading this and I'm like, I can't believe we purchased this textbook that says this stuff. So I did something that was so out of character, because I told you I'm from the generation, you write a letter to the president, right? 50s, 60s, that's what we did. So I'm like, I'm going to put this on social media. So I took a picture of the book, the chart, and I put the publisher's name, Macmillan, at Macmillan, texted it out. How are you teaching in this day and age that the color of someone's skin is a risk factor for IQ, for intelligence? And then I put at, and because I'm not a social media person, I have no clue, but I know I've seen people say at to everyone else to bring them into the conversation. So I said, who are all the race experts that I know? I'm going to at all of them, bring them into the conversation. Now, this was like 10, 11 o'clock at night. I get to work the next day by 11 a.m. I have an email, not anything, because I'm not checking Twitter. I'm not really on social media. I have an email from Macmillan saying that they're so sorry. They have the chief diversity officer who would like to have a conversation with me and the editors. Would I be available? And I'm thinking, well, I'm not going over out into the city. That's not going to happen. But we can have a conversation by Zoom. This was 2019. Excuse me. So I emailed them back, and they didn't know what they were getting into, because they just thought this was an issue with my son's textbook showing this. They had no idea that I'm in healthcare talking about healthcare disparities and why patients are dying every day through no fault of their own. So yeah, I had to help them to understand the implications of what they were saying. That was false rhetoric that was spewed back in the 50s and the 40s, and shame on them for not updating their book. So they said, yes, we'll take it off of, it was in their online textbook. They could change that quickly, but the textbook, the new edition, wasn't going to come out until January. So everyone who had that textbook from June to December, they were reading this, and all the people before then. But thankfully for us in healthcare, unfortunately, it took the murder of George Floyd to put racism out in front, for people to start having these conversations. And we're not all having the conversations. Some people are still, I don't really believe in this, or I don't even know if it really exists. But now our institutions, our organizations are saying, you have to talk about it. Because health inequities, they are killing people. And Not just that it's killing people, if that's not enough, but the fact that we spend billions of dollars on health inequities, billions. And I'm a little biased, I'll put it out there. Part of me feels like the reason why it's front and center is because it's not sustainable. We can't keep spending billions of dollars on inequities. We got to change. But how do we change? Racism threatens healthcare outcomes, and for some, racism is hiding in plain sight. But I might see it, someone else might not. So as leaders, DNPs of color, what are you doing? How are you leading? How will you flex your diversity muscle to make sure that no more leases die from the social determinants of health? How will you flex your diversity muscle to control for bias and ensure that patients like Ms. Smith have an opportunity to achieve targeted outcomes? How do you flex your diversity muscle to make sure that racism is eliminated? We can't do it alone. We will need a team. We will need allies. We will need other individuals, organizations, systems having a collaborative approach, 360. We can't do it on our own because we didn't create it on our own. So again, as leaders, as docs in nursing, it is imperative that we flex our diversity muscle and lead organizations to not only diversify. Diversity is good, right? That gets us at the table with the diversity, but it is not enough to eliminate healthcare disparities. How do we do that? Nursing has struggled to recruit and graduate students who reflect the demographics of society. Transformation has been difficult, in part because of all the reasons I already shared. Racism, bias, and social determinants of health. So you are what nursing and healthcare have been waiting for. I repeat, you are what healthcare and nursing have been waiting for. To authentically lead in a race-conscious society, you must have the capacity to interrupt dysfunctional interactions and lead with a high level of emotional intelligence. Can you do that? Can you lead with emotional intelligence when people are threatening to hijack your amygdala? We all take in information. And when we take in information, if it's threatening, it triggers our fight or flight. Our fight or flight is just a fancy way of saying the amygdala hijacked, right? So that amygdala hijack, that's going to make you respond based on emotions. We've got to control those emotions because sometimes, especially in this polarized society, people might say things that if you're not in control of your amygdala, yeah, it's going to get hijacked and it could get ugly. And we've seen some ugly scenarios. But we need the information to go from your amygdala to your cerebrum, your higher brain, where that separates us from the animals that exist out in the woods, right? We have to be able to use our cerebrum at a higher level to recognize what's going on. As leaders, you have to have high levels of emotional intelligence, and you do not have to know everything. That's a lie. You have to know enough. You have to know what you don't know. You have to make sure that you get people on your team that knows what you don't know. So together, you get the job done. But it can't be just one person, because we are not here as docs, as DNPs of color, to boil the ocean. We can't do that. But what we can do is unite and advance health equity. So how do we do that? Number one, with emotional intelligence, you have to have self-awareness. And I use the emotional intelligence from Daniel Goleman's framework. And his framework says that with self-awareness, you have to be aware. You have to be able to recognize and understand your mood, your emotions, and how they affect others. How do you make other people feel? And you have to care about it. You have to be able to regulate. And sometimes the self-regulation is hard, right? You have to count to 10 sometimes 20. You have to hear things and know that, oh yeah, that just scratched the amygdala. I'm charged, but count to 10. Wait. Give your cerebrum a chance to process this information. Because definitely, when my son came home and said that his teacher told him that being African American was a risk factor for having a low IQ, that definitely scratched my amygdala. It was hijacked. So self-regulation, you have to be able to suspend judgment. I had to hear my son say, no, Mom, it's not the teacher. She was just reading what was in the book. So what kind of conversation can I have with this teacher? We have a lot of textbooks that haven't received the memo yet. And by the time the new publication comes out, I mean, we're already talking about it and there's still publications. Our med-surg textbooks, they say things like, if any of your patients are African American or Hispanic, you must screen them for hypertension and diabetes because, by the way, they have the highest risk for these diseases. But does it contextualize this information? Does it go further and say racism contributes to the high risk? Nowhere in the book. So we can't talk about race without contextualizing, because if you do, slippery slope to racism. That's all I'm going to say on that. You've got to contextualize it. What do you mean? Put it into context. Self-awareness is number one. Self-regulation, be able to suspend judgment. Social awareness. That social awareness is the empathy piece, right? That empathy, we need to be able to understand the emotional makeup of others. We need to be able to say, I don't have to like this. I don't have to like that the teacher would tell my son what he's at risk for. That's a lie. I don't have to like it, but I do have to get to a place where I can understand how the teacher would do that. What did her training look like? Was she trained to talk about racism? Probably not. We weren't. It wasn't in my curriculum back in the 80s. But it will be today, because when you flex your diversity muscle, you need to make sure that you are part of you are, if not the authors of these textbooks, you better be part of the reviewers. Because this can't continue. This is what happens when there's no diversity. So we have self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, that empathy piece, and then social skills. How do we manage relationships? Well, we have to find commonalities. So if I had to speak to my son's teacher, if I wanted to demonstrate a high level of EQ, I would have to find commonalities. I'm an educator, you're an educator. Neither one of us were probably trained with our curriculum how to facilitate race-related discourse. So there's things you say, things you don't say. Opportunities to talk about knowledge construction and content integration. How do you construct knowledge, not based on this false rhetoric about one's IQ? Let's talk about how dangerous this chart is, because it's not true. And if you think it's true, let's start with perspectives. Does anyone have a different perspective about this? They even said if you were from a single family household, high risk for low IQ. Okay. I'm going to wrap this up. I am so encouraged. Congratulations, first of all, to your inaugural conference. Kudos to everyone who is flexing their diversity muscle. The conversations that are needed to dismantle racism, mitigate bias, and address social determinants of health require EQ, emotional intelligence. It's time to transform nursing and ensure that every individual has access to high-quality healthcare. So docs, what are you going to do? How will you flex your diversity muscle? I want you to lead like everyone is watching, because they are. Flex your diversity muscle with EQ. That's how you do it. Make those necessary changes. I thank you.